On June 4, 2026, in a quiet house in Newton, North Carolina, the oldest living champion in NASCAR history closed his eyes for the last time. Ned Jarrett was 93 years old. He died peacefully, of natural causes, in the same small Catawba County town where his story began almost a century ago. No crash, no tragedy, just a gentleman going home. But here's the thing nobody tells you about Ned Jarrett. The most famous moment of his entire life wasn't a race he won. It wasn't either of his 2 championships. It wasn't the day he pulled a burning man out of a wrecked race car with his bare hands. The most famous moment of Ned Jarrett's life happened in a broadcast booth high above Daytona International Speedway in February of 1993. And for more than 3 decades, the full truth of what happened in that booth in those final 90 seconds stayed mostly between the men who were wearing the headsets. Because Ned Jarrett, the man they called Gentleman Ned, the man who built his entire reputation on fairness, on class, on never taking sides, broke his own code on live national television. He did it exactly once. He did it for his son. And the man he wronged in that moment, the most feared driver who ever lived, Dale Earnhardt, responded with 7 words that will absolutely break your heart. Stay with me, because this is the story of a father, a promise, a fire, and the single greatest call in the history of motorsports broadcasting. And it ends in a way that nobody, not even Ned himself, could have written. Let's start with the news because the news is still fresh. The Jarrett family confirmed it in a statement that spread through the racing world within hours. They said he was a friend to everyone he met and NASCAR's oldest living champion. They ended it with 3 words: rest in peace, Dad. Not the legend, not the Hall of Famer, Dad. And if you understand nothing else about Ned Jarrett, understand this. That word, Dad, is the entire story. The tributes came pouring in immediately. NASCAR chairman Jim France called him one of the cornerstones the sport was built on. And 3 days after Ned passed, on June 7th at Michigan International Speedway, Denny Hamlin climbed out of his car after winning the race and told the world, "We lost Gentleman Ned, the original 11." The original 11, because the number 11 that Hamlin drives today, the number 11 that's won championships and Daytona 500s in the modern era, that was Ned's number first. Ned Jarrett made the 11 famous before Denny Hamlin was even born. And listen, 2026 has been a brutal year for the racing family. Just weeks ago, on May 21st, this community was rocked by the devastating loss of Kyle Busch, who drove for Richard Childress Racing in his final years, a tragedy that's still raw for millions of fans. The sport has been grieving all spring. Greg Biffle, and now Gentleman Ned. There's a generation of racing royalty leaving us one after another, and every single time it feels like another room in the house of NASCAR goes dark. And here's something that will stop you cold. The famous number 18, the car the racing world has spent this spring mourning Kyle Busch in, the car that defined an era at Joe Gibbs Racing, the very first driver to take that number 18 to glory for Joe Gibbs was Ned Jarrett's son. The threads of this story connect in ways that feel almost impossible. But Ned's passing is different from the others, because Ned's passing closes a circle that was opened 70 years ago in a cotton mill town in the North Carolina foothills. So let's go back, all the way back, because to understand what happened in that booth in 1993, you have to understand the man. And the man started with a lie. Ned Miller Jarrett was born on October 12, 1932, in Newton, North Carolina. His father, Homer Jarrett, ran a sawmill and a farm. This was hard country and hard work, and Homer Jarrett was a respected man in that community, a churchman. And in the late 1940s, when stock car racing was crawling out of the red clay of the Carolinas, it did not have a good reputation. Racing was moonshiners and roughnecks. It was fistfights in the infield. It was not something a respectable family wanted their name attached to. Bill France Sr. was still in the early years of building the sport from scratch, trying to make NASCAR something the country could take seriously. But young Ned was already hooked. He'd been driving since he was 9 years old. By his early 20s, he was sneaking off to the dirt tracks. And here's the part that sounds like a movie. Because his father didn't approve of racing, Ned competed under a false name. He borrowed the name of another man, John Lentz, and he raced as John Lentz so that the Jarrett name would stay clean. Think about that. The future two-time champion of NASCAR, the future Hall of Famer, started his career hiding who he was, out of respect for his father. And the story goes that Ned, racing under that borrowed name, started winning. He got better and better, and the wins kept coming, until one day his father found out what was really going on. And Homer Jarrett's response? It wasn't anger. He essentially told his son, if you're going to do this and you're going to be any good at it, you might as well do it under your own name. Carry the family name with you. Make it mean something. If you're going to do it as a Jarrett. Hold on to that, because that exact lesson, a father giving his son permission to chase greatness under the family name, is going to come back around in this story in a way that will give you chills. So Ned Jarrett started racing as Ned Jarrett, and the legend of how he bought his way into the big leagues is one of the greatest gambles in sports history. In 1959, Ned wanted to move up to NASCAR's top division, what they called Grand National back then. There was a race car for sale, around $2,000, which was money Ned Jarrett absolutely did not have. So what did he do? He wrote a check on a Friday afternoon after the banks had closed. He wrote a check he could not cash, for a car he could not afford, betting that he could win enough prize money over the weekend to cover it before the bank opened Monday morning. That weekend, Ned Jarrett won twice. He covered the check. That's not a racing story, that's a riverboat gambler story. Underneath all that gentleman polish was a man with ice water in his veins, and don't you forget it. From there, the rise was meteoric. 1961, Ned Jarrett wins his first Grand National Championship. 1965, he wins his second, and in that 1965 season, he did something that has never been touched since. At the Southern 500 in Darlington, the oldest and meanest superspeedway in the sport, Ned Jarrett won the race by 14 laps, not 14 seconds, 14 laps. To this day, it remains the largest margin of victory in NASCAR Cup Series history. 50 wins in his career. 50. Only a handful of men in the entire history of this sport have ever reached that number. But here's where the story turns. Because 1964, the year between his two championships, was the year that changed Ned Jarrett forever. And it's the part of his life he spent decades barely speaking about. May 24, 1964, the World 600 at Charlotte Motor Speedway. Early in the race, there's a massive crash involving Ned Jarrett, Junior Johnson, and a driver named Fireball Roberts. Fireball Roberts was one of the biggest superstars in the sport, NASCAR's first true national celebrity. And in that crash, Fireball's car ruptured its fuel tank, flipped, and erupted into an inferno with him trapped inside. Ned Jarrett's car was wrecked too. He was out of his car, he was safe, and he heard Fireball Roberts screaming from inside the flames. Screaming his name, "Help me, Ned, I'm on fire." And Ned Jarrett ran into the fire. He ran toward the burning car, and with his own hands, he helped pull Fireball Roberts out of that inferno. Roberts was burned over most of his body. He fought for his life for weeks in a Charlotte hospital, and in July of 1964, Fireball Roberts died from those injuries. He was 35 years old. Ned carried that day with him for the rest of his life. The sound of it, the smell of it, he would talk about it only rarely, and when he did, you could hear the weight of it in his voice even 50 years later, and the sport itself was changed by that fire. Fireball's death sent shockwaves through racing that helped push the development of safer fuel cells, the rubber bladder fuel containment that has saved countless lives since. Out of the worst day of Ned Jarrett's racing life came innovations that protected every generation of drivers who followed, including decades later his own son. The man who pulled a dying friend from the flames went back to racing, and the very next season he put together one of the most dominant championship runs the sport had ever seen. 13 wins in 1965 alone, but something inside him had already shifted. He had seen up close, in the most horrifying way possible, what this sport could take from a family, from a wife, from children. And Ned Jarrett had a wife. Her name was Martha. They'd been together since they were teenagers in Newton, and they had children at home, a daughter, Patty, two boys, Glenn and Dale. Little Dale Jarrett, born in 1956, was just a kid watching his daddy win championships. So now we come to the decision that shocked the entire racing world. In 1966, Ned Jarrett walked away. He retired. He was 34 years old. He was the reigning defending champion of NASCAR, 34, in his absolute prime, with 50 wins and 2 titles. Sponsored rides drying up after Ford Motor Company pulled its entire factory racing program back from NASCAR. Sure, but every team in the garage would have found a seat for a 2-time champion, and he just walked away. He remains, to this day, the only driver in NASCAR history to retire as the reigning champion. Why? Why does a man at the peak of his powers leave the only thing he's ever been great at because of a promise? Ned had made a commitment to himself and to his family that racing would not take him from them. He had watched Fireball burn. He had stood at too many funerals. He'd reportedly told Martha years earlier that he would get out early, on his own terms, on his own 2 feet, while his children still had a father. And unlike almost every athlete in the history of competition who's ever made that promise, Ned Jarrett kept it. He hung up his helmet as a champion and went home to Newton to raise his kids. And here's a detail about that retirement that says everything about who he was. While he was still driving, still competing for championships, Ned Jarrett looked at himself honestly and didn't like what he saw. He was painfully shy. This sawmill kid would win a race and then mumble through the victory lane interview, staring at his shoes, barely able to string a sentence together in front of a crowd. Most drivers would have shrugged. Ned enrolled himself in a Dale Carnegie public speaking course, mid-career. A champion, sitting in a classroom at night, learning how to talk to people. Because he'd already figured out something most athletes never figure out until it's too late. The driving was going to end someday, the man was going to remain, and he intended for that man to be useful. So when he walked away in 1966, he didn't disappear. He became a promoter at Hickory Motor Speedway, the legendary little bull ring they call the world's most famous short track, the place where half the legends of this sport cut their teeth. He learned the business side. He learned the people side. He got behind a radio microphone at MRN, the Motor Racing Network, the same broadcasting home that Bill France Sr. had helped establish to carry NASCAR's voice to the nation. Then a television camera, and over the next 30 years, Ned Jarrett became the voice of NASCAR. 22 years calling races for CBS, nearly 2 decades with ESPN. He was there as the sport exploded from a regional Southern curiosity into a national obsession, and millions of new fans learned what a restrictor plate was. That's the small device NASCAR mandates at Daytona and Talladega to limit engine airflow and keep speeds in check, what loose and tight meant, what it took to draft at Daytona, from the patient explanations of a man who had actually lived all of it. For an entire generation, the sound of a NASCAR race on a Sunday afternoon was Ned Jarrett's gentle Carolina drawl, coming through the television like a trusted neighbor explaining the sport he loved. And before he left the race car behind entirely, Ned did something that almost nobody remembers today, something that tells you exactly who he was. When he stepped away from driving in 1966, Ned sold his championship number 11 car to Wendell Scott, the first black driver to compete full-time in NASCAR's top series, a man fighting for his place in a sport and a South that weren't always ready to welcome him. Ned didn't just shake Wendell Scott's hand and move on, he helped him. That transaction, one champion handing his legacy car to a pioneer breaking barriers, says more about Ned Jarrett's character than any trophy ever could. And by the way, the broadcasting didn't stop with Ned, and it didn't even stop with Dale. Ned's older son Glenn raced too, and then Glenn went into broadcasting as well. One family, from one little town in North Carolina, supplying this sport with champions on the track and storytellers above it, generation after generation. That's not a career, that's a dynasty. And in those same years, his boy Dale grew up. Dale Jarrett was a phenomenal all-around athlete, good enough at golf that he reportedly turned down a college golf scholarship. But the pull of the family business was too strong. Dale wanted to race, and Ned, remembering his own father, remembering Homer Jarrett telling him to carry the name proudly, Ned didn't stand in his way. Dale clawed his way up through the short tracks, into the Busch Series, into Cup racing, driving for underfunded teams, grinding for years without a win, with everybody in the garage whispering the same poison. He's only here because of his daddy's name. It took Dale Jarrett 129 starts to win his first Cup race at Michigan in 1991, beating Davey Allison to the line by inches in a finish so close you could barely see daylight between the cars. 129 starts, 5 full seasons of grinding, of mid-pack finishes, of loading up the hauler on Sunday night with nothing to show for it. Most drivers never survive a drought like that. Most owners don't let them, but the Jarretts don't quit, and they don't cut corners, and they play the long game. It's in the blood. And then in 1992, Dale took the biggest gamble of his life, a gamble straight out of his father's playbook, the racing equivalent of writing a check on Friday afternoon that the bank can't cash until Monday. He left a stable, established ride to join a brand new team that didn't have a single piece of history to its name, a team owned by a former Washington Redskins football coach named Joe Gibbs. Everybody said it was a mistake. A startup team, a football coach, an unproven driver coming off years of struggle. The garage area laughed, and the car they fielded together for that first full season was the number 18. Remember that number, the 18, the same car number that decades later would belong to Kyle Busch in the most dominant years of his career. And in the years between Dale and Kyle, Bobby Labonte drove that same number 18 for Joe Gibbs Racing all the way to the NASCAR Cup Championship in the year 2000, deepening the legacy of that car even further. The number 18's entire championship legacy at Joe Gibbs Racing, the legacy the racing world has been mourning all spring, it started with Dale Jarrett. The bloodlines in this sport run deeper than people realize. Everything connects. So now, February 14, 1993, Valentine's Day, the Daytona 500, the Great American Race, Dale Jarrett qualifies that number 18 Chevrolet for the biggest race on the calendar, and his father Ned is exactly where he always is on race day, upstairs in the CBS broadcast booth alongside Ken Squire, calling the race for the entire nation. Now, for 30 years, Ned Jarrett had one unbreakable rule in that booth: no favoritism, none. When Dale was running well, Ned would go quieter, if anything, terrified that the audience would think he was playing favorites. He would catch himself and pull back, deliberately giving his own son less airtime than any other driver in the field would have gotten in the same position. He leaned so far away from cheering for his own flesh and blood that other broadcasters teased him about it, and Dale himself joked over the years that everybody else's daddy got to brag on them except his. That was the code of Gentleman Ned. The race comes first, the fans come first. Family stays out of the booth, and for the first 199 laps of the 1993 Daytona 500, that code held. Then came the last lap. Coming to the white flag, the situation is this: Dale Earnhardt, the Intimidator, the 5-time champion at that point, the most dominant force the sport has ever known, is leading the Daytona 500. The one race that has tortured him his entire career. He has lost this race every way a man can lose it. Out of gas while leading, cut tire on the last lap, beaten to the line by inches, 14 years of heartbreak at the world center of racing, the one trophy missing from the most decorated mantle in the sport, and now he's out front, one lap away, again. The whole crowd is on its feet. Everybody watching at home knows the history. Everybody can feel it. Is this finally the year? And the car climbing all over his back bumper is the number 18 of Dale Jarrett. A second-year team, a football coach for an owner, a driver everybody wrote off, hunting down the Intimidator on the last lap of the Daytona 500. Up in the booth, the CBS producer, a legendary television man named Bob Stenner, makes a decision that television people still talk about today. He gets on the line to the whole crew, every camera operator, every announcer, and he gives a command: everybody lay out, everybody go quiet. And then he says the words that changed broadcasting history. He keys up to the booth and tells him, "Ned, be a dad. Call your boy home. Be a dad." 30 years of discipline, 30 years of the code, and his own producer just gave him permission to break it. Ken Squier, the greatest wordsmith the sport ever had, physically leans back from his microphone and hands the Daytona 500 to a father, and Ned Jarrett becomes dad. On live national television, in front of millions of people, the most neutral man in motorsports starts openly, shamelessly rooting his son to the finish line of the Daytona 500. "It's the Dale and Dale show," he tells America, "and you know which Dale I'm pulling for." He starts talking directly to the car. "Come on, Dale, go baby, go." He's coaching him through the corners. "All right, come on, I know he's gone to the floorboard. He can't do any more. Don't let him get on the inside of you coming around this turn." He calls the gap, he calls the run. His voice is climbing, cracking, flying. It's the sound of every father at every Little League game and every school play in American history, except the whole country is listening, and the stage is the biggest race on earth, and Dale Jarrett holds him off. The 18 car crosses the finish line first. Dale Jarrett, the kid they said only got rides because of his name, wins the Daytona 500 for a football coach's brand new race team, with his own father calling him across the line. And Ned, voice-breaking, watching his son take the checkered flag, closes the call by sending it down to victory lane and telling the world how proud he is. To this day, that 90 seconds of television is known simply as the Dale and Dale Show. ESPN and NASCAR historians have called it one of the greatest moments in the history of sports broadcasting. Not racing broadcasting, sports broadcasting. Period. But the story doesn't end in victory lane, and this is the part most fans have never heard. This is the part that tells you who these men really were. Because while a father was celebrating, another father had just lost the Daytona 500 again. Dale Earnhardt, the man in black, beaten on the last lap of the race he wanted more than anything on this earth. And the man who had openly cheered against him on national television was a broadcaster who was supposed to be neutral. Ned Jarrett couldn't live with that, the glow of his son's greatest triumph, and Gentleman Ned was losing sleep over the man who finished second. So the following weekend at Rockingham, Ned Jarrett sought out Dale Earnhardt in the garage area, face to face, and he apologized. He told Earnhardt he was sorry for showing that kind of favoritism on the air, that it wasn't professional, that Earnhardt deserved better from him. And Dale Earnhardt, the intimidator, the most feared man in racing, the man who would put you in the wall on the last lap and smile about it, looked at Ned Jarrett and thanked him for the apology. And then he told him there was no need for it, and he explained why with 7 words: "I'm a father too. I'm a father too." The man who lost the Daytona 500 told the man who cheered against him that he understood completely. Because if the roles had been reversed, if it had been his boy coming to that checkered flag, he'd have done the same thing. That was the grace inside Dale Earnhardt that the highlight reels never showed you. 2 fathers standing in a garage in Rockingham, North Carolina, understanding each other perfectly. And friends, the echoes of that moment get heavier the longer you sit with them. Because Dale Earnhardt would finally win his Daytona 500 5 years later in 1998 in one of the most emotional scenes this sport has ever produced. And just 3 years after that, in 2001, Dale Earnhardt died on the last lap of the Daytona 500 at the very racetrack that defined his life, in a race that Ned's own son was running in. The same speedway, the same final lap. The place that gave the Jarrett family its greatest joy took the Earnhardt family's patriarch. And the little boy Earnhardt was thinking about when he said, "I'm a father too," Dale Earnhardt Jr. would grow up to win that same race twice and carry his father's torch for a generation, just like Dale Jarrett carried Ned's. Daytona gives and Daytona takes. And these two families, the Jarretts and the Earnhardts, are bound together forever on both sides of that ledger. And here's a beautiful footnote that even a lot of longtime fans have forgotten. 1993 wasn't the last time Ned called his boy home at Daytona. 3 years later, in 1996, Dale Jarrett won the Daytona 500 again, this time driving for Robert Yates Racing, and this time holding off, of all people on this earth, Dale Earnhardt one more time on the final laps. And CBS, knowing exactly what they had, opened the door for Ned to do it again. The history books will tell you he made the call But Ned himself would tell people with that humble smile that the second one could never touch the first. Lightning like that only strikes a family once. The first one wasn't television. The first one was real life that happened to be on television. There's a difference, and nobody knew it better than the man behind the microphone. Dale's career kept climbing from there. He became one of the defining drivers of his era. 3 Daytona 500 victories in total, the Brickyard 400. And in 1999, driving that famous number 88 Ford, Dale Jarrett won the NASCAR Cup Series championship. Think about what that means for one household. A father with 2 championships, a son with 1, a father with 50 wins, a son with 32, 2 generations, both reaching the absolute summit of the same mountain by completely different routes. Ned, the dominant force of the 60s who left early, Dale, the late bloomer of the 90s who almost didn't make it at all. And the bridge between those 2 careers, the thing that connects them forever, is 90 seconds of a father's voice on a Valentine's Day afternoon. Dale eventually followed his father one more time, stepping out of the race car and into the broadcast booth himself, becoming an award-winning NASCAR analyst on national television. The same family, 2 championship drivers, 2 beloved broadcasters, 2 generations of the same voice, the same values, the same name that Homer Jarrett told his son to carry proudly all those years ago at the sawmill. In 2011, Ned Jarrett was inducted into the NASCAR Hall of Fame. In 2014, Dale joined him. The Jarretts became only the second father and son ever enshrined together in that building, alongside the Pettys, Lee Petty and Richard Petty, the other great NASCAR dynasty from the Carolinas. And in his induction speech in front of the whole sport, Dale didn't talk about his own trophies first. He talked about his hero. He has said over and over through the years that the greatest thing about his career wasn't the wins, it was that he got to share every single one of them with his dad. In his later years, Ned stayed right there in Newton where it all started. He and Martha, the girl he'd loved since they were teenagers, built a life that outlasted the cheering by half a century. He raised over $1 million for the American Cancer Society through his charity golf tournament. Quietly, the way he did everything, because that was a fight that had touched his own family and he never forgot it. He'd show up at Hickory Motor Speedway, the little short track he once promoted, and just watch the local kids race, the same way somebody once watched a young man calling himself John Lentz. Young drivers would seek him out at the track, at appearances, at the Hall of Fame, and he had time for every single one of them. Ask anybody in the garage area across 6 decades and you will not find one person, not one, with a bad word to say about Ned Jarrett. In a sport built on tempers and feuds and bent sheet metal, that might be the most impossible record he ever set. He became the sport's living memory, its conscience, its gentleman. Every February, when the broadcasts would replay that 1993 call, Ned would smile and wave it off and say he was just doing what came natural. Being a dad, he never once took credit for the moment. He gave the credit to Bob Stenner for making the call to let him do it, to Ken Squire for stepping aside, and to Dale for, in his words, doing the hard part out there on the racetrack. He outlived so many of the men he raced against. He outlived Fireball, whom he tried to save. He outlived Earnhardt, who forgave him. He outlived the cotton mills and the dirt tracks and the world that made him. He became the oldest living champion the sport had, a title he held with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything else. And on June 4th, 2026, at 93 years old, with his family around him and his legacy secure, Gentleman Ned took the checkered flag. Tomorrow, on June 11th, the racing world gathers at the P.E. Monroe Auditorium at Lenoir-Rhyne University in Hickory, North Carolina. Just up the road from the sawmill, just up the road from the dirt tracks where a scared kid raced under a borrowed name, to say goodbye. They'll come from every corner of the sport. The drivers, the broadcasters, the families, and somewhere in that room will be Dale Jarrett, a 69-year-old Hall of Famer, saying goodbye to his daddy. And you have to believe that somewhere in his mind he'll hear it again. That voice, the one that taught him to drive, taught him to lose with grace and win with humility, taught him what the family name was worth, the voice that stayed professionally silent through 100 of his races, and then, on the one afternoon that mattered most, rose over the roar of 40 engines at Daytona, cracking with pride, carrying him home one last time. Come on, Dale. Go, baby, go. Because here's the truth Ned Jarrett revealed to all of us long before he ever left. The truth wasn't hidden in some scandal or some secret. The truth was hiding in plain sight, in 90 seconds of broken broadcasting rules on a Valentine's Day in 1993. The truth is that everything this man ever did, the false name to protect his father, the check he couldn't cash, the run into the fire, the championship he walked away from, the code he kept for 30 years, and the one glorious moment he broke it, all of it was about the same thing. Family, carrying the name, calling your boy home. Rest in peace, Gentleman Ned, the original 11. The greatest call belongs to you forever. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do us a favor, share it with somebody who remembers that voice on a Sunday afternoon. Leave a comment below with your favorite Ned Jarrett memory, whether it's from the driver's seat or the broadcast booth. Subscribe and turn on notifications because we tell the stories of the legends the way they deserve to be told. And until next time, go baby go.